December 8, 1963. A film set in Los Angeles. The camera rolls. Frank Sinatra stands in the middle of a take, wearing a pinstripe suit, playing a Chicago gangster. Dean Martin waits 3 feet away, holding a prop gun. Sammy Davis Jr. watches for his cue. Then a man runs onto the set. Not an actor, not a crew member. Frank's personal assistant. His face is white. His hands are shaking. He whispers something to director Gordon Douglas. Douglas raises his hand. Cut. The word echoes across the soundstage. Nobody moves. Nobody speaks. Because they can all see Frank Sinatra's face. And Frank Sinatra's face is turned to stone. Somewhere in Lake Tahoe, 400 miles away, his 19-year-old son sits in the trunk of a car, blindfolded, terrified, with a gun pressed to his head. Dean looks at Frank, opens his mouth to speak. The words don't come. Not yet. What Dean Martin did over the next 54 hours would never make the newspapers. But it would define what friendship really means. To understand the weight of that moment, you have to understand what Frank Sinatra had already lost that month. 16 days earlier, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Frank wasn't just a supporter, he was a friend. He had campaigned for Kennedy, hosted fundraisers, believed in Camelot. And now Camelot was dead. The film they were shooting, Robin and the Seven Hoods, was supposed to be the last great Rat Pack picture. A comedy about gangsters in Chicago. Light, fun, forgettable. The scene scheduled for that afternoon? A kidnapping scene. Nobody laughed at the irony. Tommy Vecchio had been Frank Sinatra's assistant for 11 years. He had seen Frank face down studio executives, mob bosses, and presidents. He had never seen Frank's hands shake. But when Tommy ran onto that set, when he whispered those 4 words, "Frankie Jr.'s been taken," he watched something break behind Frank Sinatra's eyes. Trying to make it as a singer, not writing his father's name but carrying its weight. He was touring with the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra, the same band that had launched his father's career 3 decades earlier. That night, he was staying at Harrah's Lodge in Lake Tahoe, room 417. 3 men had knocked on his door: Barry Keenan, Joe Amsler, John Irwin, amateurs, desperate, armed. They had taken Frank Sinatra's only son. Dean had seen fathers lose sons before, in Steubenville, in the coal mines, in the steel mills. He remembered his own father's face when the telegram came about a neighbor's boy. The way grief didn't scream, it whispered. But this was different. This was Frank. In 10 minutes, Frank Sinatra would be on a plane to Reno, and Dean Martin would be sitting right next to him. Not because anyone asked, because that's what brothers do. The plane took off from Burbank at 11:47 p.m. Frank sat in the front row, silent, staring at nothing, his jaw locked, his eyes empty, still wearing his costume from the film, a pinstripe suit meant for a fictional gangster. Dean sat 1 row behind, also silent, also staring at nothing, also still in costume. 2 gangsters flying through the night, looking for a real kidnapper. Neither man had spoken since the set. There wasn't anything to say. The words that mattered couldn't be said yet, and the words that didn't matter. Dean had never wasted time on those. The Mapes Hotel in Reno became FBI headquarters within 3 hours. Agents flooded the 4th floor. Tape recorders hummed on every table. Telephone trackers stood ready at the switchboard. Maps of Lake Tahoe covered the walls, pins marking every possible location. The hotel room wasn't large enough for Frank's pacing. The silence wasn't comfortable. It was necessary. Frank didn't eat that first night. He didn't sleep. He didn't call his ex-wife Nancy until the FBI insisted. He didn't do anything except pace and smoke and stare at that telephone. Frank couldn't sit still. He couldn't stop his hands from shaking. He couldn't do anything except wait. The offers came fast. Sam Giancana called at 2 a.m., promising his people could find the kidnappers in 6 hours. Frank said no. Robert Kennedy called, offering every federal resource. Frank accepted. "I'm not owing them anything," Frank told Dean. "Not for Junior. Not ever." Dean nodded, lit a cigarette, and waited. On the second night, an FBI agent blocked Dean at the door. "Mr. Martin, family only beyond this point." Dean didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He just looked at the agent for a long moment. That Steubenville look, the one he'd learned in the steel mills, the one that said, "I've been through worse than you. I am family," Dean said quietly. The agent stepped aside. 23 hours passed before the first ransom call. 23 hours of silence, of pacing, of staring at a telephone that refused to ring. The kidnappers wanted $240,000. Frank offered $1 million. He would have offered $10 million. He would have offered everything. The kidnappers said no. They didn't want more money. They wanted the original amount, the number they had planned. As if they were following a script they were terrified to deviate from. Amateurs. desperate, in over their heads. That made them more dangerous, not less. Tommy Vecchio stood in that doorway for 54 hours. He watched Frank pace, smoke, stare at the telephone, but mostly Tommy watched Dean Martin. Dean didn't pace, didn't smoke, didn't stare, he just sat there, hour after hour, silent, still, present. Sammy called twice. Jerry Lewis called once. Everyone wanted to do something. Dean didn't want to do something. Dean wanted to be something. An anchor, a reminder that Frank wasn't alone. Mr. Martin didn't say 10 words in 3 days. Tommy would recall years later. But every time Mr. Sinatra looked like he was about to break, he'd look over at that chair, and Dean would just nod. Just once, and Mr. Sinatra would keep going. The drop was scheduled for 3 a.m. on December 11th. $240,000 in a brown leather suitcase. The location, between 2 school buses in Sepulveda, near Los Angeles International Airport. Frank wanted to make the drop himself, stand in the dark, face whoever came, put the money in their hands and demand his son. The FBI said no, too dangerous, too unpredictable, too much could go wrong. Frank argued, Frank threatened, Frank pleaded. Dean said something else entirely. Let them do their job, Frank. You being there doesn't get Frankie home faster, it just gives them another hostage. Frank turned, ready to fight, ready to scream. Dean's eyes weren't hard, they weren't challenging. They were the eyes of a father who understood. Frank sat back down, and waited. What happened in that hotel room over the next 12 hours would test their friendship in ways neither man expected. December 11th, 1963, 20:47 a.m., and then the phone rang, and everything changed. The sound cuts through the hotel room like a gunshot. Frank's hand trembles as he reaches for the receiver. The FBI agents lean forward. The tape recorder spins. Dean stands up from his chair for the first time in hours. Mr. Sinatra? The voice on the phone is nervous, young, shaky. The money's been picked up. Your son is being released. Frank doesn't respond. Can't respond. His mouth opens but nothing comes out. His hand grips the receiver so tightly his knuckles go white. Mr. Sinatra? Did you hear me? Your son is safe. He's being let go, right now. The FBI agent closest to Frank reaches out, steadies him. Another agent is already on a second line coordinating with field teams. Dean doesn't move, just watches, just waits. Dean's presence wasn't about words. It wasn't about action. During those 3 days, Frank had run out of coins for the payphone twice. The kidnappers had insisted on payphone communication. Their paranoia outweighed their planning. They believed incorrectly that payphones couldn't be traced. So Frank Sinatra, one of the richest entertainers in America, had to scramble for dimes like a teenager calling home after curfew. Each time Frank's pockets came up empty, Dean was already there. A handful of coins, no words, no commentary. Just the coins placed in Frank's palm. Frank would carry 10 dimes in his pocket for the rest of his life. Every suit, every jacket, every pair of pants, he would be buried with them. The kidnappers couldn't have known what they'd started. They couldn't have understood the forces they'd awakened. The confirmation came at 3:14 a.m. A security guard in Bel Air had spotted a young man walking down the middle of the street, blindfolded, disoriented, shivering in the December cold. Frank Sinatra Jr. alive. What Frank said next surprised everyone in the room, including Dean. When the FBI confirmed it, when they spoke the words out loud, "Your son is safe, he's been found, he's alive," Frank Sinatra collapsed into a chair, not crying, not laughing, just empty, like a man who had been holding his breath for 3 days and finally remembered how to exhale. Dean walked over, slow, steady, put a hand on Frank's shoulder, and finally spoke. "He's your son, Frank. He's got your blood. They couldn't break that." Frank looked up at his friend, the friend who had sat in that chair for 54 hours, the friend who hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't complained, hadn't once suggested that maybe he should go home, check on his own family, get some rest. "Why'd you stay, Dean? The whole time? Why?" Dean shrugged, lit a cigarette. "You'd have done the same for me, Pally." Frank shook his head. "I don't know, Pally. I don't know if I could have sat there that long." He wouldn't have. They both knew it. Frank wasn't built that way. Frank was loyalty and fury and passion, but patience wasn't his gift. Frank would have stormed the kidnappers' hideout. Frank would have called in every favor from every dangerous man he knew. Frank would have done something. But Dean understood that sometimes the something you need to do is nothing. Sometimes you just need to be there. Dean didn't say "I told you so." He didn't remind Frank of the advice he'd given about the drop. He didn't take credit for the waiting, the patience, the 54 hours in that chair. He didn't need to. In Steubenville, when a man's family was in trouble, the neighbors showed up. They didn't ask what they could do. They didn't announce their presence. They didn't make it about themselves. They just showed up. Sat on the porch, waited. Guy Crocetti had done it for 3 different families when Dean was young. Dean had watched his father sit in silence for hours, offering nothing but presence, nothing but patience, nothing but the quiet promise that no one grieves alone. That's what Dean had learned. That's what Dean had done for Frank. Not the grand gesture, not the dramatic rescue, not the mob connections or the FBI raids or the $1 million ransoms. Just presence, just patience, just being there. They found Frank Sinatra Jr. walking through Bel Air at 3:14 a.m. A private security guard named George Jones spotted him first, a young man stumbling down Roscommare Road, a blindfold still hanging around his neck, his hands still shaking from 3 days of terror. "I'm Frankie," the young man said. "Frankie Sinatra, please. I need to call my father." To avoid the press who had already descended on Reno like vultures, the authorities made a decision that would haunt them for years. They put Frankie in the trunk of the patrol car, the trunk of a car, again. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially not on the 19-year-old who had just spent 3 days wondering if he would ever see daylight again. They drove him to his mother Nancy's house in Bel Air. Frank Sr. was still in Reno when his son arrived. It would be another hour before father and son reunited. The reunion wasn't private. FBI agents filled every corner of the room, but the embrace wasn't for them. They did reunite, alive, together, safe. Within 48 hours, all 3 kidnappers were in federal custody. John Irwin broke first. The guilt was eating him alive. He told his brother everything, the planning, the execution, the terror in young Frank's eyes. His brother called the FBI. Barry Keenan was arrested on December 13th, Joe Amsler the following day. $168,000 of the ransom money was recovered, stuffed in various hiding spots throughout Los Angeles. They were amateurs, desperate men who had convinced themselves that kidnapping a celebrity's son was their ticket out of debt. They had picked the wrong father to threaten. The trial should have been straightforward. 3 men, 1 victim, mountains of evidence. The defense attorney tried something desperate, something cruel. He claimed that Frank Sinatra Jr. had arranged his own kidnapping, a publicity stunt, a scheme to boost his struggling singing career. The whole thing staged. The ransom money eventually returned. A conspiracy between father and son to generate headlines. The jury didn't believe it. The judge didn't believe it. Anyone who had seen Frank Sinatra's face in that hotel room didn't believe it. But the newspapers ran with it. The public whispered. And Frank Sinatra Sr. had to sit in that courtroom and watch his son, his 19-year-old son who had been blindfolded and threatened and terrorized for 3 days, be publicly humiliated. Barry Keenan was sentenced to life plus 75 years, but he was later found to have been legally insane at the time of the crime. He served 4.5 years. Joe Amsler and John Irwin served even less, just 3.5 years each. The men who had terrorized Frank Sinatra's son walked free before the decade was over. The damage was done. The whisper followed Frankie for the rest of his life. Tommy Vecchio retired in 1978. 15 years of service to Frank Sinatra. 15 years of secrets and phone calls and quiet crises. He didn't sell his story to the tabloids. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't cash in on the Sinatra name like so many others had. He never spoke publicly about those 3 days in Reno. Not to reporters. Not to biographers. Not to the countless people who asked what Frank Sinatra was really like. But at Frank's funeral in 1998, a reporter caught Tommy outside the church. Asked him the question everyone always asked. What should people know about Frank Sinatra? Tommy thought for a long moment. Then he said, "Everyone talks about Mr. Sinatra's talent, his voice, his movies, the women, the mob, the politics. But you want to know who Frank Sinatra really was? Ask Dean Martin. Ask him about that hotel room in Reno. Ask him what he did for 54 hours while Frank waited for his son." Dean never talked about it, never bragged, never even mentioned it in interviews. That's how I know it was real. Frank Sinatra was buried on May 20, 1998. 73,000 people lined the streets of Beverly Hills to say goodbye. The service was private, just family and close friends, but the mourning was public, global. The newspapers wrote about his voice, his films, his marriages, his temper, his alleged mob connections. They didn't write about the dimes. In his pocket that day as he was lowered into the ground were 10 dimes, specifically requested in his will, a reminder of those 3 days in December 1963, a reminder of the phone calls he couldn't miss, a reminder of the friend who always had coins ready. Some stories are too quiet for newspapers. Some debts are too personal for biographies. We all have moments when the phone rings and the world stops, when the news is so terrible that we forget how to breathe, when the ground disappears beneath our feet and we look around the room for someone, anyone to anchor us. We look for the person who won't panic, who won't make it about themselves, who won't fill the silence with useless words. Frank Sinatra had Dean Martin. We all like to think we'd be that friend. The one who stays, the one who shows up, the one who sits in the chair for 54 hours and asks for nothing in return. But most of us aren't built that way. We're built to help, but the kind of help that makes us feel useful, the kind of help that lets us do something, the kind of help that has a clear beginning and a satisfying end. Dean's help wasn't dramatic, it wasn't heroic, it wasn't the kind of help that makes headlines. He just sat there, waited, stayed. That takes a different kind of strength. The strength of stillness, the strength of patience, the strength of simply being present when presence is all you can offer. Years later, when asked about that week in Reno, Dean would shrug. Frank needed a friend. I was there. He never mentioned the 54 hours, never mentioned the sleepless nights, never mentioned the moment he told an FBI agent he was family. That's the thing about Dean Martin. The biggest things he did quietly. The world saw the drunk act, the easy smile, the casual cool. They never saw the man who sat in a chair for 3 days because his friend was breaking. December 11, 1963. Frank Sinatra hugged his son for the first time in 4 days, held him so tightly that neither man could breathe, cried in a way that Frank Sinatra had never cried in public before. Dean Martin stood in the doorway, watching. He didn't join the embrace, didn't interrupt the moment, didn't insert himself into the reunion, just watched, and smiled. Then he walked outside, lit a cigarette, looked up at the Nevada sky, where the stars were just beginning to fade into dawn. 54 hours. No sleep, no food, no complaints, and finally it was over. Dean took one long drag, exhaled slowly, nodded to no one in particular, and finally went to sleep. Ain't that a kick in the head?